François de La Rochefoucauld is not a name that one hears very often in our modern age. Unless you have studied the works of Friedrich Nietzsche or have wandered down the historical path of the French moralists, this is probably a name of little significance. This is a great shame, it is a great failing on our part, for this wasn't always the case. There was a time when this name carried with it the greatest sense of the aristocratic, the so-called old noblesse. This name conjured mental images of the intellectual aristocrat par excellence. The name of François de La Rochefoucauld was synonymous with a cold, unsentimental aristocratic gaze. It could even perhaps be synonymous with truth, painful truth, the type of truth that we willingly ignore and cast aside for the purposes of being polite. Ultimately, this name was synonymous with human nature. La Rochefoucauld's story is almost archetypal. This is a nobleman who took up arms against the monarchy. He received a grave injury and then spent the rest of his life in intellectual pursuits. In the beautiful salons of Paris, he observed the comings and goings of the most capable and most virtuous. These observations were noted down by La Rochefoucauld in a very cynical manner for posterity, in a single 60-page book. These reflections, in the words of Nietzsche, were accurately aimed arrows which hit the mark again and again, the dark mark of man's true nature. This is the philosophy of François de La Rochefoucauld. La Rochefoucauld is very much defined by a single book, the Maxims. Within this book there are 504 aphorisms, spread over 60 pages. These are short, powerful sentences. A great majority of these aphorisms are no more than a single sentence. This style of writing, extremely concise and to the point, serves best for the purposes of efficacy, for the efficient delivery of a statement. This style avoids anything excessive getting in the way of one's crystal clear understanding. But we will return to the aphoristic style in a little while. There is a single aphorism that defines the entire book. François de La Rochefoucauld himself chose this aphorism to be placed at the very front of the work, beneath the title. Quote, "Our virtues are most frequently vices in disguise." The entire skeptical spirit of La Rochefoucauld can be placed within this statement. Through a thorough intellectual engagement, almost every observation made within the work can be linked back to this foundational aphorism. But in order for us to do this, for it to make more sense contextually, some things must be said of La Rochefoucauld's life. François de La Rochefoucauld was born in 1613 in Paris. His prospects were immediately marvelous. He was, most importantly, of very good health as a child, and he was also born into one of the most renowned and fortunate noble houses of France. His family lineage reaches back to the 10th century. It overflows with various counts, barons, and dukes. Many members of this family went on to become politicians and notable soldiers closer to our times. Even in our day, in fact, there is a living French diplomat who belongs to this great dynasty. La Rochefoucauld very naturally received an education that was tailored for the nobility. Matters of etiquette were drilled relentlessly. He received military training in the equestrian arts, the art of hunting and of writing letters. The historical record does not indicate any particular troubles in regards to his upbringing. For all intents and purposes, this was a promising aristocrat. He was to succeed and bring pride to the family's revered name. His early 20s were spent in various military engagements and royal schemes with neighboring rulers. This is all very classic. There are great amusing stories to be shared here, but I do not want us to veer too far away from the substance of his thought. The most notable military engagement and moment of intrigue that La Rochefoucauld got involved in was the Fronde. In essence, this was a stereotypical civil war. This is a theme that has occurred on our channel several times by this point. The nobility has an issue with the activity of the crown. More specifically, there were two frondes, one on a parliamentary level and another one on the nobility level, back to back. The root of their issues was the same. The cardinals of the crown were modernizing the French government. For this time period, modernization of course means centralization. The nobility and those princes of great influence were to be squandered in their rights. Their private armies were to be banned. All of these noble administrators were to be replaced with loyal bureaucrats, and so on. This occurred in the 1650s, and only some 80 years prior, in the state of Moscow, we observe the same process under Ivan the Terrible. Many other examples can be brought here. This was a European-wide phenomenon, manifesting differently in every culture. What concerns us in the story of La Rochefoucauld is the Second Fronde, the so-called Fronde of the Princes. The First Fronde from 1648 to 1649 was a warm-up, we could say. It concerned mainly the Parisian magistrates. But it is in the Second Fronde of 1650 onwards that the discontented masses of the nobles rose against the possibility of having their privileges reduced, of having their way of life reduced. La Rochefoucauld allied himself with Le Grand Condé. This is an outstanding French general of whom much can be said. For La Rochefoucauld, this was an alliance against the crown. By this point, owing to his participation in the First Fronde as well, La Rochefoucauld earned himself the brand of being an aristocratic rebel. He was of extreme suspicion in royalist circles, and his presence within the circles of Le Grand Condé only confirmed these initial suspicions. Despite his presence and strong support for the cause, however, La Rochefoucauld would not see the civil war through to the end. At the Battle of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine in 1952, La Rochefoucauld was shot through the head. He immediately lost sight in one eye, but did not retreat from the battlefield. Eyewitnesses claim that he rode through Paris, very slowly, surrounded by friendly troops. He was covered in blood and held in place on his horse by his son and several other noblemen. He allegedly wanted to see what the rest of the battle would bring. Shortly after, La Rochefoucauld retired to a family estate in the southwest of France, one of many that still to this day belong to this dynasty. It goes without saying that this retirement was forced upon him due to reasons of health. Here at his estate he slowly recuperated from his injury, and miraculously he gained his sight back after only a year of healing. By the time he recovered, the Fronde had come to an end. The rebellious nobles had been defeated, and royal absolutism on behalf of the young Louis XV was forthcoming. Considering that Louis XV was a child when all of this occurred, and that a majority of the heavily invested phases of the conflict had passed away within some time, La Rochefoucauld was allowed to return to court life. He was fined for his activity, not too much though, and ultimately he was forgiven. This was of course primarily due to the respect that his long lineage demanded. This return to court life was insignificant, however. It was his son who would really enjoy a decent career in court in the future. What interested La Rochefoucauld instead was to participate in the social hour of the intellectually oriented aristocracy. This is the Salon. The French Salon, in its essence, was a modern version of the Greek symposium. The best of the best, i.e. the noblest of the noble, gathered together to discuss and debate, to recite poetry over fine food and fine wine, to present moral dilemmas and receive moral answers in all of their varieties. There is in fact very little difference here to the ancient Greek symposium. Perhaps the only notable one off the top of my head is that women were allowed to participate in the French Salon, unlike their Greek counterparts. Owing to the fact that this was a pastime for the noble and well-raised, etiquette was of course of utmost importance. Ideas here were not to be debated furiously but discussed elegantly. There is of course no way to know whether this idealistic standard was met consistently. Alcohol is the rot of civility after all. On paper, there is no better way to display one's capabilities and birth new ideas than such a gathering. Plato's Symposium, as a text, shows what the Salon is capable of. This phenomenal text resulted in 2,000 years of continued interest and discussion on the one single topic of love. This is ignoring the multitudes of other digressions that can be made in a study of this great work. An individual's knowledge and social standing can be tested very accurately in this way. Within a very short time, any individual who is speaking to a group will reveal how much or how little they truly know. As is the case for many men following their physical prime, such an environment was ideal for La Rochefoucauld. He frequented the Salon and observed with a very keen eye. His maxims are, in fact, the result of this observation. In this very specific social milieu, among the best of the best, he nurtured the initial opinion he made of those he met in his younger military days, and this opinion was vastly cynical. No matter how much these people tried to present themselves as virtuous, whether they were intellectuals or military men, La Rochefoucauld found that they were not really motivated by virtue in any sense. Their primal motivation was a profound biological self-interest. In La Rochefoucauld's words, this was self-love. In fact, Voltaire went as far as to say that this notion of self-love, or profound self-interest, is the sole truth of La Rochefoucauld's entire work. Every aphorism is yet another presentation of this self-love thesis. It is 504 different angles that all point to the same truth. This only speaks to how great a truth it must be, since so many different angles seem to confirm it. So what is self-love? Let us not confuse this idea of self-love for modern notions of taking care of yourself or being kind to yourself. In the thought of La Rochefoucauld, this term means unbridled egoism and self-interest, and it is something that is not done consciously. To use a modern term, it is entirely subconscious, even instinctual. In a way, this self-love is almost another name for what is ultimately the survival instinct. The instinct to do things that would make our body and thus our mind feel in control of its surroundings, i.e., in power. La Rochefoucauld's own definition is as follows. Self-love is the love of oneself and of all things for oneself. It turns everything to its own advantage. It makes men self-worshippers, and if fortune permits them, it causes them to tyrannize over others. It only rests upon other subjects as a bee lands on a flower, to extract from them its proper food. In this sense, self-love consumes and appropriates. It is gluttonous, and I say this with no moralistic undertones. Gluttony is gluttony after all. We don't need to attach great sentimental value to it. Placed in an equal playing field, self-love will take for itself what it needs and bend it and ultimately digest it in order to gain an increased feeling of power, as a subconscious biological drive to survive and accumulate power. As Nietzsche wrote, what is good? The feeling of power increasing. It is very important to stress that this self-love or self-interest is not an active decision. In his definition of the term, La Rochefoucauld also adds that the desires of self-love are the strongest possible thing. Nothing is so headstrong as its desires. Nothing is so masterfully concealed. Elsewhere, in aphorisms 8 through 12, La Rochefoucauld also introduces the so-called passions. It is difficult to ascertain the relationship between the passions and self-love in the thought of La Rochefoucauld. Some of his writing hints at the passions being a quality of self-love, the manifestation of what is ultimately subconscious. In other places, this relationship is flipped. Self-love is thus also the unifying label for the passions. These passions are generated deep within the heart of man, and they manifest as self-love. In either case, the heart of man is thus very dark, at least by our ethical standards. The primary cause of all human activity appears to be some variation of hidden self-interest. This notion of the passions as being the primary motivator, as we will see in a little while, lay the groundwork for Nietzsche's further elaboration of what he called the drives. This hidden self-interest is perhaps our most misunderstood quality. It is this driver of man's activity that causes an array of errors. It is here where we confuse vices in disguise for virtues. La Rochefoucauld presents a variety of examples to back up his central claim. When viewing a great conflict between two ambitious men, for example, we think of them as virtuous. They are motivated by great ambition, they believe in their own cause above the others, they are willing to fight and risk everything, very bravely due to their burning dedication to some idea. The truth here, however, as La Rochefoucauld certainly observed during his military days, is that these men are most often motivated by a certain kind of jealousy. Their rhetoric on wanting to achieve historical greatness for themselves, their idea, and their people is an effect of this jealousy. It is all generated as a justification for what is otherwise an entirely impolite cause. And in many cases, these men themselves are also convinced that their true motivations are noble and virtuous. They do not consider the fact that what drives them is envy of their competitor. They wish to eliminate the competitor through any possible means as a survival mechanism, as a guarantee of their power continuing to increase. From this line of thought, it is not difficult to see how Nietzsche would further develop this idea and eventually arrive at the will to power. La Rochefoucauld sees that man is evidently confused in his evaluation of cause and effect. What we see as causes are, in fact, effects. Nietzsche also spoke about this in his Twilight of the Idols. As an example, we attribute to the great general a sense of bravery. We say that he acts greatly because of this bravery. He actively chooses to be virtuous in this manner, and the effects of this are all the positives that his activity gets him. But La Rochefoucauld sees very much that this is not the case. We are confused. The true cause is not his choice to follow a virtuous path of bravery. His bravery is an effect of what is his natural disposition. His natural disposition is one that causes him to act in certain ways. There is a set of behaviors that we then define as brave. But this natural disposition can also lead him just as much to become tyrannical. History proves this as well. There are cases of great brave men going over the top and beginning to tyrannize over their people, to tyrannize over those in whose name they fought bravely at some prior point. In our evaluation of this tyrant, we will perhaps say that he lost his way. He wandered off his virtuous path. He needs to return to virtue. He needs to be inspired again by bravery. But this is not at all what occurred. What occurred is that he was simply given a different set of resources, and these resources allowed his natural disposition to become tyrannical. It was in his self-interest to act in one certain way, to act brave in the past. It is now in his self-interest to be a tyrant. These notions do not only apply to the massively competitive. La Rochefoucauld observed the same reality in the intellectual Salon. When a man came to recite the most beautiful poem out of what seems to be a genuine love for the arts, there was an underlying unattractive motivation. This man is here to impress. He is here to show the veracity of his intellectual abilities. He wants to gain a feeling of intellectual superiority over others. This is another increase in power. His admirable love for the arts is in fact another vice in disguise. The intellectual pursuit is only a tool. It is a tool that he found to be the most suitable for his drives to engage with at this point. He bears a very strong sense of pride that requires ever more fuel, and this fuel comes in the form of praise. Man is a very peculiar animal in that respect. He wishes to outdo those around him and thus increase his power, and yet he seeks confirmation from these others that he is in fact a decent man at all. It is important to state that this self-love is very hidden indeed. Aphorism 3. Whatever discoveries have been made in the realm of self-love, there are many more still to be made. La Rochefoucauld was, in a great sense, a proto-psychologist. He was a psychologist far before the industry formed in any way. For 1500 years prior to his time, the Christian conception of man was thoroughly different. Man can come to know himself through a relationship with God and through reason. Understanding this truth, he can then act virtuously exactly as God wanted him to, and he thus attains salvation from our fallen nature. This view is, of course, fundamentally at odds with what La Rochefoucauld observed for himself. Man, in fact, does not know himself, and he doesn't appear to be able to come and know himself. What is commonly seen as a virtuous trait is in fact nothing but a certain subconscious instinct which was misinterpreted, an instinct that man has no power over in most cases. All that man can do is rationalize it afterwards, and he tries his best to make it fit into the ethical code and standards of his time. In short, this is all exactly as Nietzsche too believed. Man is defined by his instincts first and foremost. He perhaps has no control whatsoever over what sort of individual he is and what kind of life he leads, how intense his passions are and how they manifest. The only thing he can really control is how he later rationalizes on his activity. He can control how he participates in the quote-unquote falsehoods of a moralizing society. The duration of our passions is no more dependent upon us than the duration of our life. Thus, a brave commander on the battlefield who preaches patriotism and appears to hold the most noble values of kingdom and honor and such things is very often motivated by none of this deep down. His true motivation lies in personal glory, in personal ambition. He wants to rise through the ranks and gain the legacy of being a great commander with every single ensuing benefit that this brings. Once again, he does not need to be aware of this for it to nevertheless be a reality. Self-love is more cunning than the most cunning man in the world. Man can flatter himself as much as he wants and say that he does indeed believe in the ideas that he holds, but ultimately these ideas are merely a mental form of what is otherwise a very primal instinct. Many will quite accurately say that this is very cynical, but at the same time I do not see the need to attach such emotional evaluations to these observations. As La Rochefoucauld saw it, it is simply this way, and thus our eyes should instead be set on the important. How do we proceed from these realities? We look in the face of man's quote, dark heart, we accept it for how it is, and we then determine what this means for the future of man as a social, political animal. What La Rochefoucauld is concerned with is not only self-love and the passions, but also how we reflect on all of this as a society that moralizes. It is in this process that errors of judgment most often occur. Let us make a quite relevant contemporary example here. Shackled by the fact that humans are jealous and envious beings, the rich man exercises the virtue of modesty, of being humble, publicly of course. Society takes this as a great sign of wisdom and virtuous character. This is a good man who doesn't want to show off. He remembers his humble beginnings, he sympathizes with those who are worse off, and so on. However, as La Rochefoucauld would see it, this man is acting out of self-love, i.e. self-interest. His primary interest here, whether conscious or not, is to avoid the scorn of society due to his material status. What we call modesty is in fact self-preservation, the avoidance of envy. Envy itself is a dangerous passion for both those who feel it and those who receive it. In the privacy of his bedroom, this rich man enjoys his wealth. He spends it extensively for his pleasure and comfort. It goes without saying that in most cases he would not give this wealth up in the name of some kind of virtue. He would simply do a better job of maybe stashing it away. His public appearance, however, is one of modesty and gratitude. To La Rochefoucauld, there is nothing wrong with this situation per se. A man of wealth is, after all, allowed to enjoy his wealth. What is wrong here, however, is how we rationalize this set of circumstances in the first place. What is wrong is that this man has to pretend, and we ultimately know that he is pretending. We participate in this dance of back and forth pretending and assigning virtue to what would more accurately be described as vice by our society. One begins to wonder, how much time do we really waste avoiding the simple truth that this man has wealth and that he enjoys it, and perhaps that we are jealous of it? Would we ourselves not enjoy this same wealth? Would we not fear the envy of others were we to become very well off? I repeat, envy is a dangerous passion. It has moved many an individual to end the life of another. This is not to say that there is something wrong with envy. It appears to be part of the human condition as a whole. Just as Nietzsche would argue, there is nothing inherently wrong with the world as it is. Nature, and thus by extension human nature, is not wrong. It is not evil. It simply is the way it is. However, at the same time, there exists a man-made confusion. La Rochefoucauld makes this very clear. The ethical system that we judge these realities by is not exactly accurate. We live among falsehoods on a societal level, and very often these falsehoods stem from the fact that we simply do not know man well enough just yet. In other cases, it is a willful ignorance of certain truths. The ancient Greeks knew that man is motivated by envy in many cases, and when this envy overflows, it can lead to very negative outcomes. A little bit of envy, however, is alright. A healthy amount that gets you to compete with your neighbor to try and outdo him and thus produce even greater work. During the time of the ancient Greeks, envy was seen as rather healthy. It was an indicator of health. It was an indicator of ambition. Closer to our time, in the time of La Rochefoucauld, envy is a dangerous, unwanted thing that we should entirely strip ourselves of. The ancient Greeks of Hesiod and Homer's time would perhaps see this as a castration of the human spirit. Developing this line of thought even further very naturally leads us to Nietzsche yet again, for our next step is to ask, of what use is a moral system that allows for such dancing and pretending and all of this confusion? Does this serve life? Does it serve life when we spend so much time being confused about our motivations and how we evaluate them? Does it perhaps get in the way of life instead? Do we really need all this moralizing if it so often confuses cause and effect, if it so often confuses virtue and vice? In many cases, a soldier follows the orders of his commander not out of a great sense of bravery, but out of being far too timid to speak up against his superiors in the first place. We must note here that Nietzsche's development of these thoughts do not imply that La Rochefoucauld himself sought to mount some purposeful systematic attack on morality. This would be entirely un-aristocratic for him to do. For a man of etiquette, it would be unbecoming to display such heavy intentions. The aristocrat observes and judges from a distance. His judgments are not forceful but elegant. They are striking precisely because they are elegant and concise. Brevity is the soul of wit. There is almost no moral system at all to La Rochefoucauld. In his tone, sometimes one may detect a small hint, a small nudging toward what is good and what is not, but this can and has been debated. For all intents and purposes, La Rochefoucauld is overwhelmingly an observer. He is not a thou must moralist. It is unbecoming for such a man to come down to our level and get involved with what we must do and what we must not do. The aristocrat merely observes, and occasionally he comments. As we said earlier, it is up to us to determine what we do with these observations. A man like Nietzsche builds an extensive critique under their influence. From the initial observations of La Rochefoucauld that our moral code misinterprets our most foundational motivations, Nietzsche puts the scalpel to this moral code in its entirety. Famously, the genealogy of morals and the Antichrist, but not only there. Other men see these observations for what they are, an exposition on the corrupted nature of man, and choose to write them off as such. For these individuals, La Rochefoucauld only showed how far man is yet to go in his reconciliation with God. What he describes is thus not an inherent part of our nature, but more so a very deep-set corruption. We are still very far from cleansing it away. In any case, La Rochefoucauld is too much above these matters. He is too aristocratic to do the heavy lifting of critiquing and reconstructing and making suggestions for the lay people. His cold, keen eye only gazes, and it reports. I cast my wisdom before you, you do with it as thou wilt. Ultimately, the significance of La Rochefoucauld is his profound transformation of the moral question. Since the time of Plato, philosophy formally concerned itself with the question of what man ought to do. This encompasses not only what he should do, but also how he should do it. What is virtue, and how does one live virtuously? What is the highest good, and how does one strive for it? This question massively shifts with the French moralists as a whole, but with La Rochefoucauld especially. He does not ask what a man ought to do. Too many people before him have already asked this question. Instead, La Rochefoucauld simply outlines what man actually does. This makes perfect sense. Before handing out imperatives, we should understand to whom exactly we are giving these imperatives. This can also rather quickly determine whether these imperatives are even worth handing out in the first place. Let us take another creature as an example, the lion. A lion will never know how to speak English, and yet we have essentially spent centuries evaluating this lion on whether his English has improved. The imposition of a certain ethical code on man and the ensuing process of evaluating man based on this code is somewhat similar. In the case of the lion, we at least have some certainty. Scientific advance has confirmed once and for all that the lion will never speak English. In La Rochefoucauld's time, this would not have been possible, neither for the lion nor for man. Man was mostly unpierced. He was an unexplored creature, at least internally, in his depths. I remind you of aphorism 3. Whatever discoveries have been made in the realm of self-love, there are many more still to be made. In our time now, these many more discoveries have in fact been made. More and more do we now realize how much of a complex biological machine human beings really are. So much of our activity does indeed depend on certain drives that seem to have a painfully non-rational will of their own, a will that we then rationalize mentally and attempt to justify after our acts have been carried out. Man may indeed be nothing but a collection of passions, or this single self-love. Are we nothing more than a physical body that evolved due to environmental conditions? This immensely complex physical body, which ultimately acts as a vessel for self-love. Are we even a separate vessel at all? Or is every cell of our body only the worldly manifestation of a higher metaphysical self-love principle? La Rochefoucauld states that self-love will exist no matter the resources at its disposal. Its sole ambition is to exist. It does not matter whether it works with nothing at all or with the greatest inputs. Once again, this is quite reminiscent of Nietzsche's will to power. In his own words, this world is the will to power and nothing besides. And you yourselves are this will to power and nothing besides. La Rochefoucauld's influence is immensely significant. Yes, the name has been mostly forgotten, and perhaps even the terminology, but the ideas of the man have waded their way through time. I do not like to use the term ideas here, for they are not ideas proper, they are observations. And funnily enough, these unsentimental observations do carry with them a great load of sentiment, a certain aristocratic pathos, which is most detectable in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. The spirit of La Rochefoucauld lives in them. As we have made obvious by this point, La Rochefoucauld exerted a great deal of influence on Nietzsche's thought. In La Rochefoucauld there is a proto-theory of the Nietzschean drives. Quite literally, self-love drives us forward. For Nietzsche, the drives are stated in a much more elaborate way. A drive is not only a biological disposition towards some evaluative orientation, but it is also what defines our perception in any given moment. The drive of hunger will make you more prone to smells, it will make you more prone to focusing on food, and less prone towards sensations that have nothing to do with eating. This is not the only drive that exists. There is a drive to reproduce, but this drive is quite cunning. It doesn't merely demand offspring from you, but it hides behind pleasurable acts and ideas. You think that you want to sleep with an individual because it is pleasurable, or because you love them even, but the ultimate drive behind this is in fact reproductive. This drive recognizes that the individual before you is suitable for the replication of your genetic code, for the production of offspring, and it thus confuses you with great notions of pleasure and love. To put this into much easier words, at any point in time, depending on your biological structure, you are reacting differently to the environment around you. Sometimes you are motivated by one passion, sometimes by another. How intensely you feel these passions and what kinds of actions these passions cause you to do depends entirely on how you are built, biologically and thus psychologically. La Rochefoucauld formulates this in a much simpler way. We are a mass of diverse interests, which fortune or our own industry manage to arrange. Thus, it is either by luck of being born a certain way or through great self-mastery that we can try to neatly organize our numerous contradictory passions. These passions are never as rational as we think, and if it just so happens that these passions lead to some morally virtuous act, this is nothing but us later rationalizing on what is fundamentally non-rational. You were driven to act first, and you evaluated this action through the societal ethical standard later. It is not only the content of La Rochefoucauld that had an impact on Nietzsche. The style here is also very important. Famously, Nietzsche was a great student of Schopenhauer in his youth. He says in his 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy that during those younger years he still operated in the shadow of Schopenhauer. He used Schopenhauerian language, he evaluated ideas through a Schopenhauerian lens. It is also from his study of Schopenhauer, allegedly, that Nietzsche discovered the French moralists in the first place. He requested his sister to send him a variety of French books, among which we find the maxims of François de La Rochefoucauld. Nietzsche devoured these works, and especially the work of La Rochefoucauld, and thus his style transformed. In Human All Too Human, shortly after, we see the aphoristic Nietzsche. For many people, this is the Nietzsche that they know. It is not the younger Nietzsche of essays upon essays, but the highly quotable Nietzsche, the what does not kill me makes me stronger Nietzsche. This Nietzsche only came forward due to a rigorous study of La Rochefoucauld, paired with his great admiration for the aristocratic poetry of the ancient Greeks. A personal favorite of mine, Theognis of Megara, is at times awfully reminiscent of La Rochefoucauld. His short, brief wisdoms on life and man's nature were just as influential. They too were composed and read at symposiums. They too said in very few words gargantuan truths. Bright age passes as quickly as a thought. When I am well, my friends are many. When ills befall me, there's few whose hearts are true. The philosophy of François de La Rochefoucauld is, at first glance, despairingly cynical. It does not inspire much hope in the heart of a humanist. We like to believe that man, first of all, knows himself. We like to believe that our actions stem from a place of goodness, what we have determined as goodness over thousands of years of thought. We have control over these actions. We choose what we want and what we do not want. It is difficult to consider such a vastly different perspective, that man is nothing more than a combination of instinctual drives, of passions that control us. This line of thinking can be a very slippery slope to justification of certain travesties. If we are not in control of ourselves and it is our drives that determine what we do, then why do we have to bear moral responsibility for the things that we do? It does not have to be so cynical and dark, however. The realities described by La Rochefoucauld do not necessarily have to be viewed through a dichotomy of good and evil. Indeed, Nietzsche would like humankind to move beyond good and evil, backed by the observations of this noble Frenchman. Moving beyond good and evil does not mean giving up morality entirely. It simply means to shift our perspective. It is up to us to determine which aphorisms of La Rochefoucauld need to be digested and operated from. In our modern educated age, we perhaps have the wisdom to differentiate between the genuinely useful and the genuinely cynical. With an understanding of man's dark heart, this darkness can be dispelled, our thought reframed, and falsehoods exposed. Perhaps in due time, another aristocrat with a cold, lucid eye will come again, and he will observe us once more. In the distant future, it so may be that this new set of observations will be of a much more inspired nature. One can only hope.